The worst horrors of the Civil War were not always found on the battlefield. For those men who ended up in the hands of the enemy, captivity could bring suffering that surpassed anything that Gettysburg or Antietam had. Civil War prisons were ghastly places, where broken men wallowed in misery far from home. But there was one prison that stood alone, a place where thousands of men were pinned in like cattle, a place where the sewer water was the drinking water, and where an extra mouthful of rotten food was considered a luxury worth dying for. It was a prison deadlier to its inmates than the battlefield was to its soldiers. This is the horrifying fate of the Union prisoners who found themselves in Andersonville prison. By late 1863, the Confederacy was experiencing food shortages that were hitting soldiers and civilians alike. Even Robert E. Lee was complaining that his horses were starving. With barely enough food to feed its own, the Union prisoners in Confederate captivity would have even less. Many Union prisoners were kept near the Confederate capital in Richmond, Virginia, where overcrowding and food shortages had produced a crisis by February 1864. Even Confederate newspapers reported on the dismal conditions endured by Union prisoners and pressured Confederate authorities to do something about it. Their solution was Andersonville, a new prison built from scratch in Sumter County, Georgia, near an unassuming train stop. The work was done almost entirely by slaves since the locals didn't approve of the prison being built near them. The core of Andersonville was a 17-acre yard, later expanded to 27 acres, enclosed by a 16-foot-high wooden stockade. A single stream cut through the middle of the yard to serve as prisoners' only supply of water for drinking, cleaning, and waste. The first prisoners arrived by train in February 1864. The prison wasn't even finished, and there wasn't nearly enough food for them, but they were sent anyway. For those unassuming, it was the beginning of a nightmare worse than anything the battlefields had thrown at them. John Ransom of the 9th Michigan Volunteer Cavalry was one of the first prisoners. When he arrived, Andersonville was nothing more than the wooden stockade and some guards enclosing a large area with a single measly stream, what he could only describe as a dismal hole. By the end of February, 2,000 more prisoners had joined him in that hole. There was no accommodation for the prisoners. They were put in the yard and left to sort themselves out. The prisoners scavenged the grounds for whatever they could find. They used old branches and woven together vines and rushes from the stream to make crude huts known as shebangs. Of course, there was only so much that could go around. Later prisoners resorted to using their clothes as blankets or tents, while later arrivals almost had nothing at all. The prisoners also did not receive clothes. Whatever they had on them when they arrived was all they got. Other luxuries like firewood, blankets, or buckets were also unheard of. One thing Andersonville did have plenty of was lice, which were such a persistent problem that most prisoners simply stopped noticing them. Each morning began with a roll call. Since the prison was only for the regular enlisted men and not the officers, the highest rank among the prisoners was sergeant. The sergeants were made responsible for 90 other prisoners, and camp authorities mostly dealt with these sergeants directly. The sergeants would have to report in at the morning roll call and account for their 90. If a single prisoner was missing for any reason, then the sergeant and all his men would have their daily ration withheld. The daily ration was barely enough to avoid starvation as it was. Typically, it would be a quart of cornmeal and a few ounces of salted meat. They were not given any firewood or utensils to cook anything, although in the early days some prisoners managed to forage for roots to use in small cook fires. The prisoners did eventually persuade the guards to allow supervised firewood parties to go outside the prison, but they could not gather enough wood for everyone. There were no plates or dishes either, so men ate out of their hands or turned their hats and boots into dishes. Later, a bakehouse was set up, but it couldn't hope to serve everyone. So each day, half the camp received cooked cornbread, while the other half received raw cornmeal to cook themselves, alternating each day. Not only was the food not enough, it was also terrible quality. According to Captain Wirz himself, in a complaint to his supervisors, he wrote, "The bread which is issued to prisoners is of such an inferior quality that it is almost unfit for use. The food often arrived rotten or moldy, but the prisoners had no choice but to eat it anyway. The foul food caused sickness that made the entire miserable situation even worse. If there was one consolation, it was that little was expected of the prisoners. Most weren't forced to labor or perform any particular duties on most days. They would have been too sick and weak to be any good at it anyway. Daily life was spent caring for the sick and dying or plying new inmates for information about the outside world. New prisoners arrived every week, sometimes every day, so there was a constant trickle of new faces to replace the ones dying. Some inventive prisoners managed to find ways to be useful. A fellow prisoner taught Ransom how to create a washboard so he could start his own laundry business. In exchange for any money prisoners had, or more often a portion of their bread, he'd use water and sand to clean their ragged clothes. Prison life produced its own strange societies. Many prisoners were captured with other members of their unit, and they often stuck together. Coming from the same state or county was another easy way to find company. Prisoners arranged themselves into streets and neighborhoods within the stockade, setting up the shebangs and tents in some sort of order where they could. These simple communities were the lifelines for the men inside. But no amount of company could protect them from the true power in the camp, the ruthless guards and the deadly discipline of Captain Henry Wers. Captain Wers was the prison commandant with a mandate to keep order and prevent escapes by any means necessary. He was a severe man who made regular inspections of the prison yard for any signs of potential escape or plotting. Ransom hated him. He described Wers as scrawny, pale, and sneering. "Makes a fellow feel as if he would like to go up and boot him," Ransom wrote. Wers showed little sympathy for his prisoners. Many would approach him during his inspections and beg for better food or water, but his response was always the same: "It is good enough for you Yankees." Within a few months, everyone in the prison came to hate him. In Ransom's words, "There are 1,000 men in here who would willingly die if they could kill him first." Nothing represented Wers' ruthlessness better than the deadline. The entire camp was enclosed inside the stockade walls, but to prevent prisoners from attacking or scaling those walls, a line was demarcated about 15 feet further in. This was known as the deadline, and its name was explanatory. Any prisoner who crossed the deadline would be shot by the sentries on the stockade, no questions asked. It did not matter if a man tripped and fell or merely reached an arm under the fence to grab a fallen bit of food. The sentries would shoot them anyway. Confederate Private James Anderson was so disgusted by the camp that he wrote a letter to Confederate President Jefferson Davis, begging for him to step in. He complained that prison guards were shooting prisoners just for the fun of it. They would simply gun down a prisoner near the deadline and lie to say they'd been trying to cross it, and none of the other guards cared enough to question it. Anderson begged President Davis to send someone to investigate. "Let a good man come here as a private citizen and stay 1 week, and if he doesn't find out things revolting to humanity, then I am deceived." Inevitably, some prisoners tried to escape. Captain Wers recorded 81 separate attempts to tunnel out of the prison by July 1864. The vigilance of the guards and offers of rewards to those who ratted out their fellow inmates stopped most escapes before they could be attempted. Other attempts went further. John Ransom himself managed to get outside the walls in April 1864, only to be chased down by the dogs a few hours later. The guards were surprisingly forgiving of escape attempts with most prisoners, simply being returned to the prison and giving a few days hard labor. They knew death would come for them anyway. Death came for the men of Andersonville in all forms of disease, infection, and starvation. There was no such thing as sanitation in Andersonville. In the cramped space with thousands of men, it was impossible to prevent the lone stream from becoming contaminated. All waste, washing, and drinking had to come from that stream, and the results were hopelessly predictable. Inside the stockade, the prisoners tried to ensure that all waste was downstream from the drinking area, but it hardly mattered. The prison guards' camp was upstream outside the prison, and all their waste and filth flowed into the water anyway. The camp's cookhouse also slung its waste into the water before it reached the prisoners. Cholera, dysentery, and other waterborne diseases were rife among the prisoners. The stockade wall and prisoner activity inevitably interrupted the flow of the stream as well, causing stagnant water to build up, further polluting the water supply and inviting all sorts of bacteria and insects. The appalling state of the prison was highlighted by the fact it needed multiple hospitals to deal with the sick, but even those were poor. The first hospital on the site was just a set of tents pitched next to the prison latrines inside the prison courtyard. The smell was atrocious, and the close exposure to the sick patients to the regular prisoners made it easy for disease to spread. The hospital was later moved outside the stockade walls, but not before hundreds of prisoners had become needlessly ill or dead. By summer 1864, the prison had just 13 doctors to care for around 26,000 prisoners, and most of those who entered the hospital never came out. The poor nutrition caused its own havoc. With no fruit or vegetables in their diet, many of the prisoners suffered from scurvy. Starving people are more vulnerable to just about every disease, and with 13,000 people packed into the space by May 1864, it was difficult to imagine a more perfect breeding ground for it. Typhoid fever was the biggest killer, spreading easily between prisoners and claiming lives every day. The lack of sanitation was also a breeding ground for gangrene. With only contaminated water available and no soap, wounds and bites were easily infected. The hospitals amputated gangrenous limbs almost every day, a procedure which carried plenty of its own dangers too. On top of all of this, the humid Georgia weather and the low stream cutting through the camp was the perfect environment for mosquitoes. Mosquito-borne diseases like malaria brought their own suffering and death, and with so much filth around the camp, it was easy for bites to become infected and turn septic. On average, Andersonville lost between 100 and 140 prisoners a day. A squad of prisoners was assigned daily to expand and fill in the mass graves outside the stockade walls. Guards would enter to clear out the bodies once a day, usually first thing in the morning, so that the burial squad could have the fresh bodies buried by sunset. Dr. Joseph Jones visited the camp in September 1864 and gave a detailed report on the conditions. He criticized the poor food and terrible hygiene which were producing such staggering casualty rates. This gigantic mass of human misery calls loudly for relief, he concluded. Conditions were beyond desperate, and it was only a matter of time before prisoners turned on each other. Infighting among the prisoners produced some of the deadliest and most dramatic moments in the entire history of the prison. With so little to go around, reports of theft and fighting over resources began immediately. People fought for food, clothes, wood, and other basic items, as Union loyalties gave way to survival instinct. Even in the hospitals, there were reports of prisoner volunteers stealing from patients and trading these items to the guards for food or other things. The worst of these thieves were the Raiders. The Raiders were originally formed at Belle Isle Prison in Virginia, but its members were among the first to be transported to Andersonville and become a feature of the prison from the start. The Raiders took whatever they wanted from whoever they wanted. They stole food, clothes, blankets, money, and other valuables from their fellow prisoners. As far as they were concerned, Andersonville was a dog-eat-dog world, and they were the top dogs. They amassed hundreds of members and built good relationships with the guards in order to smuggle in contraband to them. In exchange, they gave them things stolen from other prisoners and often ratted out escape plans to the camp authorities. The Raiders were a well-known menace, but they were too large for anyone to do anything about them, at least at first. They attacked, robbed, and sometimes killed with impunity. Prisoners who had their unit or other friends to back them up might find safety in numbers, but lone prisoners were especially vulnerable. Among the morning's dead, it was common to find prisoners with throat slit or stab wounds from trying to resist the Raiders. The Raiders do as they please, and we are in nearly as much danger now from our own men as from the rebels, Ransom wrote in his diary. Eventually, though, the Raiders pushed too far. Groups of prisoners began banding together as protection squads to repel them. These squads would become known as the Regulators. On June 29, 1864, one prisoner named John Urban was attacked for his pocket watch, but the Raiders hadn't realized he went to Regulators nearby to help him. Urban and the Regulators fought off the Raiders and immediately went to the guards to demand justice. Captain Wirz himself came to investigate, and soon ordered that all rations would be withheld until the Raiders turned themselves in. The next morning, about 100 Regulators armed with clubs supplied by the camp guards marched on the Raider section of the prison. An almost equal number of Raiders turned out to meet them. For most prisoners, their battle was the most exciting thing that even happened in Andersonville. Raiders and Regulators charged, striking each other with clubs and grappling in the dirt. However, the Raiders were mostly thugs and thieves, while the Regulators entered the battle with a deeper conviction. The Regulators won the melee, killing several Raiders and capturing the rest. Other Raiders fled into the camp where they were hunted down over the next few hours and handed over to the guards. 30 or 40 of the worst characters in camp had been taken outside, Ransom wrote in his diary, and still the good work goes on. By the morning of July 1st, 100 Raiders had been captured and several killed. The prisoners sorted out their own punishment for the Raiders. Many were made to run the gauntlet through the lines of angry prisoners who beat them with sticks. Some were simply beaten. The Raider leaders, however, were given a prison trial. They had testimonies from inmates like John Urban identifying the worst Raiders and their leaders. In the end, they sentenced the 6 worst Raiders to be hanged. One of those Raiders, Charles Curtis, pleaded with the camp authorities for a Confederate trial instead. He petitioned Wirz's superior, General John Winder, whose reply was blunt: "I shall try you myself, and I shall order you to be shot. The Yankees have sentenced you to be hanged. Which do you choose?" On July 11th, all 6 men were hanged. It was a sad reflection of life in the prison, that the desperation among the prisoners had become so bad that they would have such gangs and turf wars over scraps of food and petty trinkets. Even then, solving the Raider problem was a drop in the bucket. "Good order has prevailed since the hanging," John Ransom wrote cynically in his diary the day after the hanging. The men have settled right down to the business of dying. The execution of the raiders was a small bit of justice, but it was a small victory compared to the scale of the suffering at Andersonville. The true questions remained. How many men would live to see freedom again? And would anyone truly pay for the atrocities that occurred inside those stockade walls? Life in Andersonville did not get much better after the end of the raiders. A death rate of between 100 and 150 people a day continued. Life was an unending monotony of misery. John Ransom's diary entries, which earlier in his stay ran for paragraphs every day, degenerated into single sentences just to confirm he was alive. Ravaged by scurvy and malnourishment, Ransom was eventually transferred out of Andersonville in September 1864 to a hospital in Savannah. "Am in heaven now compared with the past," he wrote, but thousands of others remained in hell. The desperate conditions forced desperate action. The camp authorities made the unprecedented decision to allow 6 of the prisoners to head back to Washington, D.C., to petition President Lincoln directly for prisoner exchanges. Even beyond Andersonville, Confederate prisons couldn't cope with the number of Union prisoners. Andersonville was the worst, but men were starving and dying everywhere. However, their pleas for exchange fell on deaf ears. The Union was reluctant to accept prisoner exchanges. General Grant believed freed Confederate prisoners would only go back to the battlefield and prolong the war. Northern newspapers publicized the plight of the Andersonville prisoners, but prisoners they remained. When prisoner exchanges did happen in the final months of the war, it was reserved only for the sick and did not include Andersonville. Andersonville Prison remained in operation until May 7, 1865, when Union representatives arrived a few weeks after the surrender at Appomattox. One of the first prisoners into Andersonville had been Dorrance Atwater of Connecticut. He was educated and wrote well, so he'd been chosen to work under one of the prison surgeons as a clerk. While there he realized how many men were dying, and without any other means to help them, he made it his duty to secretly record the names of everyone who died. The prison also kept an official record, but he was worried that it would be destroyed before camp authorities let it fall into Union hands. By the time Andersonville was liberated, Atwater had recorded over 12,000 names. They were an irrefutable condemnation of the prison and the man who ran it. The Union was reluctant to prosecute many Confederate figures after the war. However, the horrors of Andersonville were so immense that there was no way to avoid punishing someone. Captain Wirz was arrested shortly after Union men arrived and put on trial for conspiracy to harm the prisoners and murder. Over 3 months, 160 witnesses took to the stand to describe what they saw in vivid detail. Much of what we know about Andersonville comes from this trial, as inmates and Confederates alike testified to the appalling conditions of the prison. The trial was controversial and its outcome all but certain. Captain Wirz was found guilty and hanged on November 10, 1865. He was one of the only Confederate officers executed by the United States for crimes committed during the war. Another Andersonville employee, James Duncan, was found guilty of denying food to prisoners and sentenced to jail. Between February 1864 and May 1865, 45,000 prisoners walked through Andersonville's gates. Disease, infection, starvation, exposure, camp guards, prison gangs, and other horrors would claim the lives of over 12,000 of them. With a death rate of about 30%, it was the deadliest prison of the Civil War, and had a higher mortality rate than the Union or Confederate armies did on the battlefield. Today, most of the site has been dismantled, but a graveyard remains to honor the men who died there. The Civil War nursing hero Clara Barton helped organize the graveyard, and described Andersonville as perhaps the worst atrocity she saw. Andersonville was not the gateway to hell. It was hell itself, she later wrote. It was a hell that 12,000 souls never escaped from.